Hello everyone and welcome to our very first lecture for the year. In this lecture we're going to take a look at what is a primary source slash document, and then after the lecture you guys will participate in a primary source analysis activity where you're going to read a document and then answer some of the questions that you're going to see in this lecture, as well as some specific questions to that document in terms of what you read. All right, so let's get started. Now, a primary source is pretty much anything that comes from or was created during a period of time in question. It's an original source. So if you're looking back, let's say in ancient Egyptian times, if you're looking at an actual hieroglyphic piece, that would be an original source as long as it was created during that time and is not a recreation. It can be a document, an artifact, recording, pieces of art, a person, picture, anything that you can think of that is a primary source. We tend to think of, when we're talking about primary sources or secondary sources, we tend to think of just like pieces of paper or like books. But no, it's really anything that you can think of that is an original source. And I have an example there on screen being Pericles' funeral oration is a really good example, and you can find it in your book, or at least a selection of it in your book in the ancient Greek chapter. Now, the other type of source, so you have primary sources, the other type of source is secondary sources. Secondary sources are non-original documents, but they deal with or comment on a primary source or a collection of primary sources. The best example I can give to you of a primary or a secondary source, excuse me, is your textbook. Now, your textbook talks about past events and actually has collections and excerpts of primary sources that are located within it, but that doesn't make it a primary source. It's still secondary. If you read a book written by a historian, let's say if you read a book that was published this year that talks about the Civil War or the 1919 Spanish flu, those are secondary sources. Now, the main reason why we're doing this lecture and taking a look at a document afterwards and doing an analysis of that document is so that you guys can learn how to dissect them. And a lot of this actually works for secondary sources as well, but we're going to stick to primary sources here. So here's some questions that will actually come up while you're looking at, or questions you should consider while you're looking at a primary source. You're going to see that some of them seem very similar to each other, and they are. And also, you might look at them and answer them, and it may be the same answer or a very similar answer between one and the other, and that's okay. And that's okay when you're looking at documents. It shows that you're trying to discern what you're reading. So the questions that arise are: who's the author? Who wrote or created this document? The next one is the audience. Who's it for? It's very important that when you look at a document or source, that you need to understand who it's actually for. The third one is the form. What is it? What are you seeing? Is it a pamphlet? Is it a painting? Is it a book? Is it a person? Okay, that's the form. The context, and I think this is the most difficult one for students to understand, is what is the historical situation at the time of that document or source's creation. And you can also pull in the audience with this as well. Think, okay, who was it intended for? What are you looking at? What's going on at that time? Remember, context is what is happening at the moment of this source's creation. The message is, what is it trying to get across? What is this source trying to get across? The method is its display. How is it written? How is it displayed? This can actually be very similar to or exactly the same as the form, depending on what you're looking at. If it's a written document, it might be something different in terms of different from form, as it might be a poem versus a essay or what have you. But it can be the exact same or very similar to. The bias is, what are its reasons for creation? This source has to be important for some reason, and you can also add in, when you understand who the author is, what possible bias or biases does that person have in its creation. The next one is the intent or purpose. What was the author trying to do or get across by creating this source? Again, this one's actually very similar to the message, but can be a little bit different. And then the last one is, was this source a success or failure? Do you buy it as a source that should be used in looking and studying for studying a certain topic? Or going a step further and looking at it and say, was this source a success or failure during the time it was created? Could be another question that you bring up that's connected to that last one there as well. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at some sources here. So we're going to actually look at a couple pieces of art here. And I want you to kind of think in your mind, and we'll discuss these if you're in class, if you're watching this online. Please just take a few moments, take 30 seconds to a minute, and try to think back to these questions and think, what do you see? What do you know? What is the intent or purpose of what you see on screen? And just kind of jot some notes down and go from there. And then move on to the next one, because we're going to take a look at about 3 or 4 here. All right, for those of you that are at home, this is depicting Alexander the Great fighting the Persian Emperor Darius III during his expansion period, when he was warring with the Persian Empire, and this is his victory at the Battle of Issus, and is a very, very important artistic piece from the time of Alexander. Now, take a second and look at this piece. What do you see? What are some questions that are coming up based on those questions that we had earlier about dissecting primary sources? Please feel free to pause it if you need to. All right, so this piece of art, this is actually the Darius or Darius, depending on how you want to pronounce it, treasury relief. You can see that it's roughly from around 550 to 486 BCE. We don't know who the author is. We do know the location. It's from Persepolis. And it depicts the giving of gifts to the Persian king for the new year. So what does that tell you about the society? And this is the things that we got to look at. Look at the intent. Look at the purpose. What are you seeing? Okay. Always, when you look at something, whether it's a piece of art or you're reading a document or whatever, ask those questions. Think about what you're actually seeing or reading as you move through the sources. All right. We're going to move to this one, our next one. This should be pretty easy to tell where it's from. But again, think about that for a second. What are you seeing? What is the purpose? What's the intent? What are you learning from this culture, from what you see from this piece of artwork, this primary source? All right, so this is actually a mural. It's in the tomb of Thutmose IV. We don't know who made it, but we do know it's Egyptian. I mean, it's pretty obvious. The location, it's still there. And it depicts King Thutmose IV facing various divinities who stretch the sign of life towards him, which is known as the Ankh. And that tells us a lot about the Egyptian culture, specifically in terms of religion and how they view death and life and death. Okay, and then again, what about the text above his head? What are you seeing? What do you guys think that is? What is that telling us? What does that tell us about their writing system? These are all questions you have to think about when you're viewing a source. Okay, now the next one here, again, pause it if you need to. What do you see? What does this tell you about this culture? What do you see in this actual piece of artwork? And so forth. Look back to those questions that we've looked at and answered in the last couple of documents. All right, so now we're going to move on. This is our last slide here, just to wrap it up. These are the Babylonian archers, or what is known as the Babylonian archers. Again, we know the location, where it came from, because of who found it. It's presently, this piece of art is in Berlin, so it's been moved. And this shows us in terms of a lot about the military equipment and soldiers of the Babylonian Empire. And think, why would this be important? Why would this particular source be important? Okay, so again, I know this is a pretty simple, straightforward lecture. There's a lot of going back and forth, thinking about what you see, what you read when you look at primary sources. But remember, as we move forward, the second part of this lesson is going to be, you're going to actually read a primary source, and you're going to take a look and answer these questions, as well as some specific questions to the source that you're going to read, which will be the Declaration of Independence, and you will turn that in. As for that, that's all I got for you guys. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments on Google Classroom or send me an email. Have a good one.